All right. So the next talk, panel actually, securing the digital supply chain. What we should do for supply chain security and DevOps. We have Harvinder Dhani, Tanya Janka. Am I saying this right? Like, just okay. It's one of those you read your name constantly, but you never say it out loud. So, like, you're never sure. Dwayne Budzak and Michael Schwab. So, take it away. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'll start. So, my name is Harvinder Dhami, and I'm a principal security consultant with Epic IT Security. So, I did incident response all my life, but nowadays, I got to call into incidents where, DevSecOps related. So I thought, it's a good to talk about, how we are doing, the security in supply chain for DevSecOps. So, yeah.
I'm Tanya Janka, and I work at SEMGREP, and I'm head of their community and education. So I run a big academy. I speak at conferences, and I try to share information, and then I give secure coding training. And I also love software and helping to make it more secure. Dwayne?
Dwayne Budzak. I've been working in IT as a software developer and architect and pointy-haired boss for something over 30 years now. In fact, someone out in the audience recognized me from a job I had back in 1993. If that's not depressing, I don't know what is. So my interest in security is, trying not to victimize people with software. I've got strong opinions about that. But I'll pass it off to Michael because he's got opinions too.
I think anybody who has been in this industry for quite a while has opinions, some of them well-formed, some of them not. So Michael Schwab, Director of Application and Product Security for the Government of Alberta, trying to develop a DevSecOps program for the government to ensure that we can instill security practices in the full life cycle of apps, and also looking at some policies with regard to that and security architecture for the entire GOA.
So as you see, there is one government guy, there is one, private consultant, sorry, Dwayne, and one service provider, which is Tanya. So, whenever you, start implementing DevSecOps, you always need a technology, something like SEMGREP. And you always need, someone to implement, Dwayne. And there's always definitely a customer, right? And so this is the theme that we are running with. So my question to all of you, what are the current exposures and recent supply chain attacks we are seeing in the wild? And we heard a lot of shift left approach, wherever, there's a lot of talks on it. Is it working with DevSecOps, with supply chain? So let's start with Tanya.
I feel like you asked two questions. So a recent big exposure with supply chain is the polyfill attack. So basically there is this really popular open source library, and there was one human being supporting it, and he got tired and had a life and other things happened. And so he told everyone he's going to stop supporting it, and then he let his domain expire. And who ever lets their domain expire? That's like saying my dreams are over. And so he didn't have $12 more to renew it. He let it go. A malicious actor got that. They changed the thing. People downloaded it. Bad stuff happened. So that's an example of bad ones. I don't think that's a problem with the ecosystem of the way we don't support open source. In my opinion, that's the problem there. If we're going to all use open source, especially at giant companies, maybe we should pay for it.
Yes, and get something, right?
So yeah, I want to hear your opinions.
And this is a tough one. Everyone can bust me too if I say it depends. That's illegal up here, right?
It's illegal. Yeah, it's not allowed.
So some of the recent attacks, this one you probably wouldn't think of as an attack, but to me, it's probably one of the most massive denials of service that we've seen recently. And it's probably going to result in some really interesting things. CrowdStrike.
Yeah.
How much stuff did that take out? Do you think there's going to be multi-billion-dollar lawsuits out of that one?
Yeah, probably.
And of course, there's our classic ones like MoveIt. Everyone was using this piece of infrastructure. It happily got compromised. And guess what? Your solutions are toast. And then, of course, as Tanya was alluding to, open source is big. lots of camping going on around common package names and the like. And I'll let Michael go because I think he probably has a comment or two about stuff like that.
So there's a couple of things. So with the development of DevSecOps, one of the things we want to do is have a carrot for developers to come in and do things in an automated fashion. A lot of those tools, NPM, for example, will go through and check to see if you have vulnerabilities. And there has been this new thing called AI, and it's been being used to generate CVEs. Some of them rightfully correct, some of them not so correct. And it's what somebody on YouTube has called DHoS, or distributed harassment of service. So think of a single open source developer being inundated with a bunch of reports that are questionable and having to go through and sift through all of these in addition to actually doing the development of the open source library or package that they're supposed to be doing. It's becoming a bit of a problem because those reports may have a high impact assessment, and it may go through and kill those CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Another aspect I think that's coming up is things like bad actors coming in, XZ, that library, coming in using this similar type of approach. The individual, like Tanya said, may be a single developer. They may have other things going on in their lives, and they may find that they're inundated with this stuff and can't handle it. White Knight comes in, tries to save the project, and all of a sudden you get these compromises injected in. And you find that you have somebody at Microsoft who has probably a little OCD and determines that, half a millisecond or half a second of something is too long and starts it again. That's not the typical user experience. So, yeah.
Okay. You want to add something?
You had two questions. The second one was about...
Yeah, the second one is shift left approach is working when it comes to supply chain.
Okay, so I really like the idea of shifting left, which means starting security earlier. So we're going to build software, and instead of showing up at the end and saying, you did everything wrong, how I gave you no guidance, you didn't follow what's in my brain that I never told you about. So that doesn't work. And so shifting left is like, what if we showed up at the kickoff meeting? What if we gave you guidance on every single part of the system development lifecycle? And it does work if you do it that way. But unfortunately, marketing people, and I work with lots of marketing people, and we have friction sometimes over things like this. They're like, oh, shift left means buy our product. I'm like, that's not what it means. And so we have had a lot of marketing people who are better at marketing than us security folks telling the world shift left means buy a product. And that's not what it means. And they've really blurred the meaning, unfortunately. And we had a marketing consultant who is telling me shift left kind of means whatever you want. I'm like, no, it doesn't. It means this. And she's like, no, it does. Like, what made you the expert? And then I showed her the top page of Google results for pushing left, and I'm 7 of them. And I'm like, I'm literally like, no. And she doesn't work for us anymore. Anyway, what do you think, Dwayne?
Unfortunately, I'm in violent agreement with you. Shift left is kind of an interesting concept because people are taking it and running with it in ways that resonate for them. I was chatting with a gent who's a software developer fairly recently, and I won't mention any names. And he noted that his instructors at school were telling him that shift left is CI/CD pipelines. To me, that's way too late. If you've already got code, you haven't shifted left.
Yes.
Security needs to be a first-class consideration, like Tanya was saying. If you're not baking into your requirement set, you're missing out. If you think you can test it in, like you can test in quality into your system, that's just crazy talk. And again, this gets back to, as Tanya also noted, and I appreciate her perspective on the products and vendors, no disrespect intended. It's too easy to slap that label on something. And for us as professionals, it's too easy to go for retail therapy, where we think if we actually buy a product, it will solve our problem, rather than having to retrain people to consider security upfront and bake it in through the life cycle. You folks all know this stuff, so it's too easy to talk to. And I'll let Michael offer his perspective.
Culture eats tools. So, you can have a nice tool. It might have a nice dashboard. Really easy to ignore. If you don't go through and incentivize the individuals to do the right thing, think the right way, change the way that they're delivering and operating, the tool isn't going to do anything for you. You'll have an invoice and you'll have a capability that no one is using.
Yeah.
So Harville, just add a little color to that too. I don't know if you folks have been keeping up with some of the research and stuff that's going on in this field. So about 5 years ago in 2019, Meta did a massive study of what works in security and security pipelines. They found out that if security items come up outside of the developer workflow, it will not get addressed. If it's after check-in, the developer has moved to their next task. They will not go back. Doesn't matter, high, critical, whatever, they will not address it. And this was the security team at Meta raising critical vulnerabilities to management. Didn't happen.
Well, and it costs so much more.
Yes.
Like, so who here has been a developer before? Lots and lots of us, right? So imagine you're actually coding and it tells you, oh, hey, we don't use inner HTML here. Instead, we use this. You're like, oh yeah, I forgot. And then you do the thing. But if 6 weeks later, after you've closed that code and you're working on something else, maybe in a different language, and then you get an email from the security team, you're like, I'll do that later. And then later's maybe never.
Oh yeah, it happens all the time. So next question, we talked about, let's go to your first point, where, you said, there is one person supporting the package. So if you see, on GitHub repositories, GitHub repos, there is so many packages, for Node, for Python, for Go, and developers downloading them and executing as system on their computers, and then they got popped, right? And as a service provider, what are the primary security challenges that you are facing in ensuring the integrity of third-party components, the using in the tools, and also in open source libraries, as we saw, numbers of open source packages are increasing every day, in thousands and millions actually. So
okay, so I have some bias because I work at a company that works in that. So take everything I say with a grain of salt. So we have a lot of products right now that you can get, and they'll be like, you have 100 libraries. Cool. 50 of them have vulnerabilities in them of some sort. Awesome. We're not going to upgrade and change literally 50% of all. We don't have time. We have things to do. So now all of the tools are starting to change so that what they'll do is they'll say you have 100 libraries, 50 of them have vulnerabilities, but only 2 are actually reachable from within your code. So if you have a library, the library doesn't do one thing. If you include the math library, it's not like, all I do is addition. It does everything, right? So it might have 500 or 1,000 functions. The vulnerabilities in one function or 2 functions or 3 functions usually, unless it's log4j, SolarWinds, et cetera. But most of the time it's in one function. If you don't call that function, you're cool, you're fine. And so I feel like we need to look at context more. Or for instance, it's yes, we have this vulnerability, but it's on a system that's it's air gapped. So how is someone going to attack that? So yes, we should upgrade it at some point, but it's literally air gapped. So maybe that could come after something else. So I feel like we need to look at context more because we can't fix 4,000 vulnerabilities in one app. We have work to do. So I think a lot of AppSec teams are working harder to prioritize things so that they're giving a reasonable amount of work to the developers and doing the shift left that Dwayne and Michael were talking about, so that in the first place, we're avoiding some of those vulnerabilities if we can. So in the idea, it's hey, so image tragic was pretty bad. What if you just didn't use that library at all? Anyway.
Yeah.
And so this is again where I'm going to riff off of what Tanya said. To me, a lot of what you said is absolutely bang on. And for the developer sandbox, that's one place where we're underutilizing the tools. Not everybody, again, this is contextual. Lots of teams and products and places are mature, but the same tools that exist in that CI/CD pipeline also exist in your developer sandbox. Why don't you catch the stuff up front? The other thing that you can do for me as a developer, and I confess to I'll pretend I was a developer at one time and wrote a few lines of code. Some of them were even good. Some of them were bad. But write something in there to tell people which paths are not meant to be used. If you're going to go forward with a vulnerable library, do something to make it obvious that you've managed that vulnerability. As Tanya said, if it's a path thing where some things are not going to get used, what's the next guy going to do if he sees you're using that math library? And there's another function there. The math library is already there. What's he going to do?
Yeah.
Use it. So wrap it. Put a comment in. Do something to tell people not to do it. I mean, to me, one of the big defensive things you can do is actually use the tools. And apologies, I know I'm going on a little bit of a rant here. But most development organizations are still at a level 0 or 1 in terms of maturity.
Yes.
We're not doing the known good practices. I've seen very few places doing actual honest to God code reviews. I've seen very few places doing effective code reviews. Your human brain is probably actually your best tool. And it's really interesting because really smart people don't necessarily apply it well because, again, the context is king. There was another thing that was done recently, which was kind of interesting. They tried to penetrate the Linux kernel. So some security researchers submitted some changes to the kernel, all of which were poisoned in some way. They were all benign poisonings, but they were all poisoned in some way. You think those things got through the review process? They did. The study was retracted, so you won't find it. But it was retracted on ethical grounds because they didn't ask for permission to do this. I hope the team took away the fact that their code reviews from a security perspective weren't working. And they need to add that to the code reviews. But again, Tanya's bang on. Shift left works, add in the tools, and part of that tool is the wetware. Don't forget that.
Okay.
And the one thing I'll add, so I recently had a conversation a couple of months ago, and it was about a vulnerable package. And it was a discussion about, I don't really want to fix this, but it's a critical and high. And so the conversation was, okay, you've gone through and you've checked your code, but what about what you're actually relying on? So your Django server, your other things, right? Did you assess those? You get things out of the box for those, and those have been published to the internet. Have you gone through and done the due diligence on that? I know what the answer was. It was pretty much silence, look down, mute.
Can I add one more thing?
Sure.
And a thing that I've been trying to do with a lot of clients recently, assuming they're on board the security train, so that's a big jump, is trying to do layers of abstraction. So if we are, shifting left, we're doing all these things, that's great. But what if we add other layers of mitigation? So just like Dwayne said, adding a comment that says this part's not okay, right? So we're using this library. We know there's a big risk in here. Don't use these functions. You could also put like a security wrapper library. So when you tab off of it, it's like it renames it to, please don't call derivative function. Or come see Tanya if you do. Right? Like it could be something like that. It could be adding a WAF and adding a rule to the WAF that if anything looks like an attack on that thing, it blocks it. Like there's layers of things we can do if we want to take things seriously. And sometimes it's faster to write a rule for your WAF than it is to actually upgrade a package if the thing's really old and depends on it. And
Log4j was just tip of the iceberg. So, my next question to the implementer, kind of from an implementer perspective, how can organizations effectively integrate supply chain security measures into CI/CD pipelines without causing any significant disruptions to the development processes? Is there any quick win that organization can get, kind of with this approach? So
we've talked about a bunch of these already. Without disrupting developer process is a funny one because, again, in theory, good practice is and it should just get used. In practice, good practice is not used, which is why we exist. So to me, the things that you can do are take a look at your SDLC and see where you're falling down from a security perspective. If you're not considering security requirements up front, if you think you're doing DevSecOps and you're not thinking about security up front, you're not doing DevSecOps. Have security requirements, have them articulated, have people have to opt out of them. That's one of the first things. Do design reviews, do security design reviews. If you've got an asset that's highly critical, if it's at your highest protection level, bring in professional security folks to take a look at your design too. Not saying the developers can't do it, not saying the architects can't do it, but other folks can help. Same thing with the tooling. Again, we talked about the developer sandbox. The tools exist in your sandbox, use them. I mean, lots of folks like turning the warning to levels way down on their C compiler because it makes the job easy, but it also makes the software more vulnerable. Put the tools in there. And then on deployment too, look at what you're deploying, validate that what you think you're deploying is what you're supposed to deploy. Actually sign your binaries and get things out there. And then as Michael said, at the end of the day, a lot of this is about culture. The first thing you're going to have to do if you want to do this effectively is change the culture. And to me, one of the key elements in there is the accountability. So you see a lot in the, we'll call it the industry press these days about developer flow and not interrupting developer processes. To me, that's cool. You need to get work done. The developer productivity is about getting functionality done, but it's not about writing code. It's about delivering good function that works. And part of the work thing is the security of it. So if you're going to download a library and you're going to use it, I want to give you the decision rights to do that. But I also want to give you the accountability where if you've downloaded something that's really naughty, guess who's going to get called out if that thing gets busted? So give you the decision rights. You also get the accountability. And I also have to support you by letting you know what you can do about these kinds of things. Getting back to where Tanya was talking, defense in depth, right?
Yeah.
And you guys are easy. You're easy to sell on that. Developers are harder. But we also have to change their jobs to make it so it's not just about cranking out code. It's not just about lines of code.
Yes.
It's about functions that work. And if you'll pardon me for a little bit more of a ramble before I hand it off to this guy, and this is, again, a minor rant, that's where actually AI today is falling down, but maybe AI tomorrow will help because the AI of today is about cranking out code.
Yes.
It's directed at junior developers.
Yeah.
The thing that differentiates a junior developer and a senior developer is the senior developer is thinking about the whole context in the system and trying not to write code. The junior dev is trying to solve today's problem. The senior trying to solve tomorrow's.
Yeah.
So that's another problem to ask.
Okay. Michael, do you have any comments on it?
I guess what I would also say is the development lifecycle isn't just about code. It's also about the context that code runs in. And it's also the context of what that code is running to automate.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding where your code is going to run, what the intended purpose is, what the context of the information that system will operate on, very critical.
Mm-hmm.
It also will require a bit of a change in the way that the business approaches this as well. Because I think, at least in what I have seen, the business usually takes a hands-off approach to the technology. That's not us, that's tech, right?
Yep.
I think there has to be a stronger relationship between the business and the technology side of things, because if you go through and you have a crap business process and it has holes, software isn't going to solve it. It'll make it faster and it'll automate it. But if you've got a process where, for example, you don't have segregation of duties or other types of things, technology is not going to solve that for you.
Mm-hmm. Tanya, do you want to comment?
I thought they were awesome. I don't need to say anything. They said everything. Oh, but Dwayne has more.
If I can if I can cheat, one thing that Michael touched on I think is really critical is the business side of the equation. I actually chatted with someone recently about some issues that I saw in a project they were working on and asked why they were there, because I know these folks knew better. And they said, we talked to our business folks and they wouldn't let us. The business is the ultimate decision maker, right? It's their functionality. They're paying for it. I'm currently working with CGI and the government of Alberta, and government of Alberta has an awesome risk management process put in place. So the question was then, was that risk formally accepted by the business? And given the risk that's there, is it isolated to just this product, or do we have to escalate it because it hits more? So again, just wanted to note that Michael hit it. The business can also be an impediment to security because is the accountability managed?
Can I add one tiny?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sure, go.
So, who here's done threat modeling before? Threat modeling is a super great way to get the business on board. When you explain, I remember working with the Canadian government and explaining, then this could happen to our citizens. And all their faces changed. And all of them are like, that, we can never allow that. And I'm like, so please let me fix this. And then all of a sudden I had authority. And so if you can talk to them in their words, which is a lot of what threat modeling is, and show them potential results. And I don't mean use fear, uncertainty, and doubt all the time. I mean, literally, this could happen. Let me show you how it could happen. I find you can get really far. So threat modeling for the win.
And I like that too, because to me, that's the ultimate shift left. If you can do threat modeling and do it early, double thumbs.
That's how you start, right? As a customer, like, kind of my question to you, what are your main concerns? Because as a part of the government, you acquire many tools, many third-party tools. But as a customer, what is your main concerns when it comes to the software supply chain? Can you share any experiences, like vulnerabilities or any incident that caused like in GOA?
So I think with respect to what we have to hold the vendors to account for, again, if we've hired them for something, we can't go through and externalize the accountability. At the end of the day, the business or technology, someone in your organization, even if it's contracted out, still owns the risk,
Yes.
right? There are certain mechanisms you can go through as a purchaser of services or products to ensure that the proper processes are put in place. So these would be things like the requirements for the contract, what types of behaviors or programs do they have in place, how have they been assessed, right, by a third party so that they're not going through and gaming their report. Not that they would do that. So things like SOC reports, vulnerability reports, if you can get them. And in some cases, there's one vendor in particular I'm thinking of where things had been fixed, and then 2 months later they pop back up, and it's like Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Why? And then you have a conversation about that, right? About where, we've contracted you to do this. We expect you to perform in a certain way. If you're not if you're not performing to that level, you have to hold them accountable. The contract is the only way to go through and do that you have legally.
Yep.
And so you have to go through and ensure that you have pretty damn good contract management to make sure that those terms in the contract are upheld.
Yeah, like really good procurement strategy, basically. Okay. Do you want to add any comment, Tanya?
I agree. Please, government, hold them accountable.
Yes.
My tax dollars ask you.
One thing I'll add to that is it's extremely difficult, especially if you're contracting for agile or in an agile way. Because in theory, you don't know what's going to be delivered. But again, to me, you can still contract for quality. Believe it or not, one of the things that development industry has forgotten over about the last 30 or 40 years is there's actually predictive models around delivered defect densities. Those things it's not magic. You can actually predict how big a piece of software is reasonably. You can predict delivered defects. You can predict all this kind of stuff. Pop it in the contract. And again, allow room for negotiation, but set your expectations that, this is what I think the world should look like when you're done. I accept the fact that you're not perfect. You'll deliver some defects. You'll deliver some security issues. But after this, it's on your nickel, and I'm going to reject your project. If you don't do that, you're accepting whatever you get.
Yes.
If it's just if agile equals code and fix, you're doing it wrong.
Something you can add to your contract. So I work at SemGrep full time, but then I also give secure coding training because that's what my last company did, and people still kept offering me money, and I like it. So I say yes. And over the past year and a half, so before that, I would always train the in-house software developers, and then they would record it, and then the contractors could watch it if they wanted to. And it was this big divide of we don't train contractors, blah, blah, blah. So recently, a bunch of companies have started putting it in their contracts. If you want to write code for us, you must take one secure coding whatever per year. And so I'm starting to get hired by the consultants themselves. And they're all taking an unpaid day to come and train 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever we're doing, right? And so you can add that to your thing. If your devs haven't had any secure coding in the past year, I'm sorry, you're not coming. No security training. I don't want you writing stuff. Because this has been a point of conflict, especially with governmental organizations where why, if I'm hiring someone, they should be qualified to do the job. So I'm not allowed giving them the training. So you can force them to have the training in another way.
This is really interesting because one of the things that comes along with what Tanya is speaking to is craft versus profession. And that could be a very long and very beery discussion for all of us. So we won't get into it. But I think it's absolutely fair to have an expectation that people have been doing development, that they have an understanding of how to actually write good code, not just how to code. They have to understand what good is. A gentleman I know has been calling himself a professional software developer for years, and I keep getting surprised by the fact he doesn't know anything about software metrics. He doesn't know what actually drives risk in software development. To me, that's shocking. And yet he's a professional software developer who's been cutting code for 20 to 30 years.
Yep. So this is the last question to all of you. After that, we will take questions from the audience. Looking ahead, what emerging trends or technologies do you guys see or believe that will have the most significant impact on securing the digital supply chain in the next few years? And how should organizations prepare for them? Like, do you have any recommendations for that? We can start with you, Michael.
I didn't want to say AI, but I'll start that off. So I think that's probably going to be one of the big things. And I know in reviewing some of the opinions online about like Copilot, GitHub Copilot, the question of, what is it outputting? Is it of high quality? What are you accepting in terms of blindly accepting things and turning this off? Because again, software is developed by wetware on hardware. So, ensuring that you have the capability of understanding what good is and what you have to do to meet the mark. And one of the things I was going to say is, in the previous question is incentivizing not just for the delivery date at the business level, but also making sure that you're protecting your information and how that software is being developed as well.
Okay. Great.
Now, for me, this will be slightly different. The big deal that I see coming is more legislation, regulation, and litigation around software and software security. I mean, you can correlate that to the AI thing. Regulation of AI is already real, but we're going to see the same thing with the software. Again, CrowdStrike cost billions. Do you think there's going to be a class action lawsuit out of that? Do you think there'll be legal repercussions? Absolutely, for sure. Not an intentional security breach, but effectively a massive denial of service. And effectively, Microsoft, unfortunately, probably ends up with some liability for giving access to its kernel to third-party providers. That's going to hit the fan. And those folks have deep pockets. So this also goes back to where Michael was going. Accountability is going to land. It really is. The end user license agreement that says you bought the software, but you don't own it. Oh, and we're not making any declaration about its fitness for use. So if it actually happens to do something useful, it's purely a coincidence. To me, that's got to go away. Yeah. And open source is going to get hit by this as well. At the end of the day, most open source contributions today are by big companies. Google, IBM, Microsoft are the biggest contributors. I can see some liability from that, even if the source is open. I've seen some things like, well, I won't call out GitHub, but the advanced security.
But I just did.
The advanced security features that they put out is open source, except the only thing you can do with it is extend it for their use. How open's that? There'll be change.
Yeah. No, that's not the answer.
Okay, I have three things. And one is a thing that's already here, which is autofix. So when we started, security tools would be like, you suck. This is where you suck. But now they're like, there's a problem. This is the risk of the problem, which is why we think you should fix it. And now they're actually doing like pull requests with fixes. And I'm very excited about this. And I remember in 2022 being excited about this and having the CEO of the place I work tell me that's impossible, that will never happen. And now I work at one of the many places where that is happening. And so I want all of you to demand autofix from whoever's reporting bugs to you. Yes. And then 2 dreams. So things I want to see. One is I want to see universities and colleges teaching software developers secure coding. Yeah. No, it's not just for the cybersecurity master's program to learn security. Mm-hmm. If you are an electrician, you think they don't teach you safety. They're like, oh, if houses burn down, that's, the safety person's problem. No, computer science must teach security from now on, starting today. And the other dream that I have, because that's a dream, the other dream that I have is that companies that use open source will start contributing back, and they could contribute fixes. They could contribute a pen test. They could contribute $5,000 a year. Yeah. Big companies, you have $5,000, right? Like I see companies that use Zap. My friends at Zap are like, yeah, this company runs 4,000 scans a week. They haven't given us $1 in 5 years. Like, come on. You have some money. Like you don't have to give them hundreds. Give them $1,000. Give them something. So those are my dreams that I hope happen. Michael?
Yeah, I was just going to add to Dwayne's point about the regulation. So we're starting to see this happen. So Bill C-26 here in Canada, the U.S. has got an executive order that's probably a couple of years before that. And it's starting to go through and creep into the security realm. If you have an incident, you're required to report, right? And if you have an incident, there could be some monetary damages to that. And, as far as Bill C-26, I won't get into detail, but for some of those industries, they have long-term financial goals. They have hard assets that are priced out to 30 years. And there's not a lot of wiggle room for them to go through and include that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm hoping that this is going to be a bit of a wake-up call to try to do the right thing as early as possible to ensure that over the long term of that physical asset, dams, generators, etc., that they don't have those types of things crop up and then all of a sudden the customer is paying for it. Because at the end of the day, the revenue is tied to this one thing.
Like there is many regulation bodies, there is a regulation body for oil and gas. There is a regulation body like for even government, like privacy. Is there any do you think bringing a regulation body for software security kind of makes sense? Not just government is coming and passing a bill. Maybe someone gonna follow it or not. Maybe people, like when I go to incidents, there's we're not reporting it to privacy because we have these loopholes to and I said no, you have to kind of notify at least the customers. And I'm not a lawyer, but legal has to so don't you think that something is missing from the regulatory part on the software security in North America? I don't know about the US, but Canada, I'm not aware of anything like that. So.
Wait, this has been talked about again for 30 or 40 years about professionalizing the discipline of software development. There's various kicks at that cat. To me, I wouldn't do it for software security solely. Embedded in software development, like Tanya was saying, it should be part of your professional job. In theory, the IEEE has taken a look at this. You've got the Association for Computing Machinery. Here in Canada, you've got KIPS, but nobody's backed it. And some of that's been because professionalizing has also been looked at to some degree as a way to exclude practitioners, which means people fight it. Like my background, my degree's in commerce, been in IT for 30 years.
Okay.
I could be excluded.
Yeah. And now I'll open floor to the questions, to the audience. Kind of, if anyone has questions.
I'm actually going to dive right in. Since I have a microphone, a lot of the problems I see is where someone will design, have a bunch of specifications for a piece of software or sometimes hardware, saying, "Oh, it needs this." It's like designing a car. It's like, okay, it should look vaguely like a box. Okay, 4 wheels. Oh, you actually have to specify the 4 wheels in the corners. Okay, things like that. But we seem to be forgetting a step in a lot of these design documents that these software development places overseas and stuff like that are building exactly to specification. Oh, by the way, you should specify that car should not explode after 500 miles. Putting a simple line of, and oh, by the way, this should pass, basic muster for security and best practices would actually go a long way to stopping this, because if you're a small little startup, you don't know what questions to ask or things in this design. If you just put, by the way, this should meet this standard, I think that would go a long way to solving things, because at least then you're offloading it, and they might say, oh, well, we can't actually do that because we don't know how, because we're the cheapest bidder. What are your thoughts on having a boilerplate thing like that in contracts?
It should be part of the requirements document for every single new project. And that's a thing I do. And I give away one for free on my website because I just kept telling people. So I was like, I'll write it for you. Just copy and paste it and start. Just delete anything you don't like, add whatever else you want. But just there must be a threat model done, or there must be a scan with this, and you must fix these things, etc. The more specific you are, the more you'll get what you want. And I find a lot of security professionals expect the devs to just know. And that's a mistake.
Expecting the car not to explode after 500 miles.
We're expecting them to know that we don't want the car to explode. And we're expecting them to know that they should do this or that. There's no, well, they should know. That doesn't work. You don't get what you want. As a person with little ones at home, you need to tell them exactly, or there's got toothpaste in their hair and stuff in their mouth, and you're just like, oh God.
I'd say generically specify it. And the other thing I like is the idea of templates, especially templates for requirements, but keeping in mind that those have to get adjusted because everything's contextual, right? I may not care if the car explodes after 500 miles if I'm only going 490. So if I've got a purpose-specific system that's insecure and is only going to live for a week, that's a business risk. I might be willing to accept that risk. That's okay.
Mhm.
And I'll put a little bit of a plug in because my big boss is over here. But one of the suggestions with respect to that would be maybe go talk to Cyber Alberta. Maybe suggest that as a community activity, right? Various different vendors and the government will have different experiences. Collaborate. Put out a community-based recommendation. Just thinking through it.
Martin, did you have a question?
Okay.
And then there's questions at the back.
Yeah.
I know.
I'll start.
Big fan of you, actually, Tanya, and those guys are okay. But my question, actually, you talked a little bit about that, Michael, in terms of context, understanding the context. Render, you were going exactly where I was thinking. I like shift left a second time. For me, data. You need to understand the data that you're managing before you even start coding. So I'm going to go with something a little bit more controversial. Before I go there, Alyssa is doing a really good presentation tomorrow on threat modeling, if you guys don't know. So if you want to know, go see her tomorrow morning. Good plug, right? But but what I was thinking is, to be a little bit controversial, being government, we get hit sometimes with we need this app out within the next couple of weeks, as opposed to having a normal cycle to do things. Do you believe in various levels of thoroughness from a security perspective as you're developing an application, depending on maybe the data you're dealing with, its sensitivity, the fact that there might be privacy issues versus no privacy issues? Do you believe it's something like that where you can adjust so the effort is not necessarily as involved depending on the context and the data you're dealing with?
That would be part of the requirements thing. So when you're gathering requirements, it's like, is this going to contain super sensitive data? Is this going to be a mission critical app? Is this going to be available to the public or just internal employees? Another thing you could do is do templating. Like when I worked at Treasury Board, we created a template because we created services for all the other federal departments. And so we had a template that had all the security built into it. So we had this huge kickstart whenever we started anything. And then, I don't know if you know, but you can call the other governments and they'll give you a copy of whatever you want if you ask nicely. And so I feel like maybe the government, like all levels of the government, municipal is hard, but definitely provincial and federal, maybe they could work together more often. When I worked at CRA, they were very obsessed with risk. And yeah, we would just rate everything like, risk is medium, this and that or whatever. And then we had like this matrix of, okay, so then we got to do this, that should be fine. We got to do more of that, et cetera. And I feel like if you have this checkbox that's very clear, like a checklist, you check all the things and you're like, oh, it turns out I have ADHD. It turns out I'm super sensitive. Whatever the thing is that you have to be, right? Then it makes it really easy and obvious of the things to do. And then have those things further cycle down to now my requirements are these. Also, you were saying with requirements, not just web apps, APIs, serverless, every single technology you're dealing with, like from the beginning, there's an API, that's awesome. Here's your gateway. Here's this, here's that. Here's all these things that I expect every time you use an API. And so if we had that from the beginning, the devs can work faster, especially if you have code samples for them. But add on. Yeah,
the one thing I would say is it's great to have policy for policy instruments, but if you don't have a compliance and enforcement side of the relationship, as they say, as Jeff said in the keynote, it's not going to get you much.
Compliance and culture.
Correct.
You need both, right? Because if they're only doing it because you're going to whack them with a stick, that's a lot harder. If instead you can get 80% of the people to do it voluntarily because you've built a culture around that and the expectation is, of course, you would do that, then you only have to hit the stick once in a while. I see Harvinder, he's the boss of us. We should listen.
Yeah. So very recently, we had a situation where
Mike, towards your mouth.
CrowdStrike was, they rolled out a patch and it affected systems, and so I asked this question to my AVP in the office that if we have a situation like this, say for instance, Microsoft rolls out a patch and people are not able to work, and I had different kinds of answers. So the question I would like to ask is, what would you recommend as the business BCP/DR program in this kind of incident or risks, as it were? And also, I beyond, because I listened to one of the speakers, and he was saying something about penalization in contracts, giving maybe putting it in the SLA that, if there's a failure or something. Beyond that, the immediate recovery to the business, what would you recommend? Because, take for instance, my organization, we are like 10,000 users, and we're scattered across Canada. When Montreal, have users in Vancouver, Toronto, and these are laptop users. You also have critical infrastructure servers too. So how would you, if that scenario plays out, what would you recommend, for quick recovery of the users and services to come on board online?
If I'm going to start, so I'm a software person, not a network person. So I don't do the people in the office with their host machines. But generally, if you have software, a bunch of it, like custom software, a bunch of it should be mission critical. And that should be on your business continuity planning, your disaster recovery. And you should have a plan to be able to roll that out when everything's screwed. You should. And I've worked at places where they can. And like a bunch of things went down and they're like, don't worry, we just rolled out into the other cloud. Or we did this or we did that for the mission critical only. And for the rest of it, it's like, it's not mission critical. You got to wait, right? For networking stuff of like my colleagues needing to have access to that's not me. That's not the work I do. But I feel like you should be identifying your mission critical software. And that includes software as a service as well, right? Like maybe Office 365 is mission critical for you. I know I can't get a lot done if I don't have Slack. So finding all of the types of software that you can't do business without and making that part of your plan and having a plan and also having a backup plan. I've seen a lot of companies where they have a CI/CD and it's Jenkins and it's local and they lose it and their lives are very bad for a very long time. So if you are doing stuff completely locally and not cloud-based, that's bad. And if you are doing everything cloud-based, think about having all those eggs in only one Amazon basket or only one GitHub basket. That's disconcerting too. And having like a second backup that happens once a month somewhere else, I think is a good idea. And by once a month, I mean maybe more often.
I'll just offer one more thought about that one. Again, I like where Tanya is going. But obviously, one thing that hit with CrowdStrike, very interesting incident that Tanya mentioned was we don't seem to consider our operating system for our clients as critical software. So maybe we need to everyone patch tests, but obviously not for that one. But maybe one of the backups would be even something like having AVDs available that could be provisioned quickly with your critical software on it if the local boxes are down. Because in that particular case, your local box was out and you couldn't roll out anything to it. But if someone's got a home box that they can get into an AVD, an Azure Virtual Desktop or what have you for it, it's a way to have business continuity.
We couldn't do a patch test. That's why this was so catastrophic, because of the type of, you had to roll it out everywhere or nothing. That's why it was so bad.
And just one more thing. So the other thing too is if you have a DR process or a BCP, ensure that you're testing it. Make sure that it actually works. We do this annually for most apps, but understand what that is. And then also look at the dependencies. Because I was on a program lead architect for something that the government of Alberta did. I had to argue that, Skype at the time was a mission critical app. How else are you going to communicate with your other team members? And they didn't get it.
Hi, everyone. My question is on the shift left approach. From a development standpoint, do the developers feel like it's an overhead on them? Like they don't need to do the security work, whereas this falls on the security team? And what are the steps that can be taken in order to fill that gap moving forward? Thank you.
That's a good question.
You can start.
So yes, this is where I was saying, like, you can have a tool, and if it is ignored, that dashboard looks awful pretty in red. The other thing too that could happen is if your developers don't understand what the system is telling them, the context, why it's actually important that they fix this, they're more likely to just go through and say, addressed, and there's no pull request associated with it. So education is key. And that's one of the things you talk about dreams. One of my dreams is having a tool, hint, 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 that will go through and look at a vulnerability that's discovered, and then also go through and not necessarily do an auto fix it, but maybe give context as to here are some samples given the context of something that you might want to consider to fix it. Mozilla Observatory, one of my favorite tools. One of the reasons for that is if it discovers something, it has. If you're running Apache HTTPD, consider this. If you're running Nginx, consider this. If you're running something else, consider this, right? Context. It's not just something bad is happening, big red critical, maybe high. It's actually giving them some steps as to what to consider and where to look. Because maybe one of the first things that developer is thinking is, where do I start?
I really like that question. And I've seen a huge variance among the development staff. Some folks are absolutely spot on, rock solid regarding security. Others, no clue. And again, that's the lack of professionalization of the discipline. But one thing that's interesting there that I think could be a compensation, people treat it as damage if they haven't planned for it. So if you're doing a waterfall project, and it still happens, there's no reason not to have your security activities planned in. If you're doing an agile project, make sure the security requirements are in the backlog. If there's nothing in the backlog, it ain't going to get done. And one thing that this gentleman has done, and with that gentleman's support, is trying to make a role called security champion and make that effective. So every product team has a security champion, and that person is accountable, not, I won't say accountable for the security because that's again a business decision, but accountable to make sure that the right activities are planned and executed. And right means context specific. So the business doesn't want to do it. Cool, we get the decision recorded. And he said, you said what? Say it again.
Awareness. So the current incarnation is I have Dwayne on my team. I have one other staff member, Sean. Excellent guy. There's 3 of us. We have close to 200 product teams for just new builds. I'm not up for being split. As much as I like being a whole self, I'm not being like even going through and quartering me. It's not enough.
So I wrote a book about this called Alice and Bob Learn Application Security, and then I gave free lessons on it all throughout 2021, which are available on my YouTube for free. So you could start there. I also have a free course on how to build an application security program that helps you shift your whole program left. So if you already have one, it helps you improve it. And if you don't have one, it helps you build from scratch. And it's free, available on SemGrep Academy. So that's just for starters. I start with a training. The training helps change the culture. They start learning the things they need to know. They start learning why there's a value. They start talking about it. Then a Security Champions program is a great way to continue. You centralize as many things as you can and standardize in your software development process. So you have a system development lifecycle that's the same for everyone instead of everyone doing their own thing. And then you start building security activities in that happen every time that are supported by awesome humans like this. And also update your tools so that they're not for software developers. You know, when you pet a cat backwards, it doesn't technically hurt it, but it wants to murder you, right? Get tools that don't feel like that, right? So sometimes that means you have to throw things out and start again. That's okay. But if the devs hate it, they won't use it. And I have more thoughts, and we all would love to talk to you outside after when you eat lunch. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.